Now there's also PhocosLink, it's called, a mobile BLE app. This one is about 85% completed, so we're just actually testing it right now. We've developed it fully ourselves, and this will be available on Apple's App Store and Google Play within the next 4 weeks, roughly. That's our current target. So you can see here that will give you a monitoring solution, a local monitoring solution of the device. It allows you not only to see the current state of your system, but it also allows you to program some of the settings of the system. Now let's look at some of the benefits. I'd like to compare this to discrete system components. So traditionally you would have, if you're working in an off-grid system, you would have an inverter, you would have a charge controller, maybe you have a charger from an AC source like a generator or something. Then you need to hook all of those components up to each other, make sure they speak the same language, take care of synchronization, all those other issues. So compared to that scenario where you're really taking one component for each function, we have a much, much lower cost in this system. I mean, we're talking for the 5 kilowatt AnyGrid, we're talking $999 as an end customer list price. So if you compare that, buying an 80 amp charge controller, an 80 amp charger from the grid, 5 kilowatt inverter, and all the other stuff you would need around that, we're talking a fraction of the cost. We're talking a third, maybe a quarter of the cost. Also, we have a much, much easier installation and a lower complexity, because obviously if you have many different devices that need to speak to each other, it can get quite involved to set that up and to have things running reliably for years. Then we have the automatic synchronization to the AC source. So regardless of whether you're actually using an AC source or not, as soon as you connect something to the AC input of the AnyGrid, it will automatically synchronize. So it will see that there's an AC source there, there's a voltage there, it will check if the voltage is correct, it will check the frequency, and then it will adapt its own frequency to the frequency of that AC source if it's within the permissible window. So it really takes all of the guesswork out of synchronizing to AC sources, and it just means you don't need to have external synchronizing switches and things like that. Then there's no need for any inter-unit communication, except for obviously if you're using more than one of these AnyGrid units, where the communication is very simple. We have a very easy programming, a very easy definition of priorities, much fewer cables in the system, fewer fuses, fewer pretty much everything. And you can get all of your data in a single unit. And then finally, I think the most important point is it's set and forget. You just set the system up and it will just do its thing. You don't really need to care much about it. Some more benefits are the ecosystem around the AnyGrid. So we have support for PylonTech lithium iron phosphate batteries. They have 48 volt batteries, so this is only valid for the 8 volt model. The 24 volt model, PylonTech just doesn't have 24 volt batteries for those. But for the 48 volt model, there's a special cable. You can ask for that from Phocos. We have that ready for you, and then it becomes pretty much a plug-and-play affair between the AnyGrid and the PylonTech batteries. We will also implement further lithium battery protocols as we enter negotiations with various lithium battery manufacturers. Then, as mentioned, we have the PhocosLink mobile app. We're also working on remote monitoring, but I can't give you any dates on that yet. So in other words, connecting this thing to the internet and having a platform for remote monitoring, it's definitely on our roadmap, and we're working on that. But again, I can't give you any dates on that yet. Then we have very extensive documentation and training and technical support. We have reliable help from our side to help you for sizing the system. And we've been around for, well, almost 20 years now. So we know what we're doing, especially in the off-grid world, and also increasingly in the grid world as well. Now, arguably, maybe the most important benefit of this device is the high PV input voltage. If you want to compare this to some of the other off-grid inverters out there, which may or may not interface with the grid regardless, first of all, most of them don't have any charging from PV. You will need to connect them to an external charge controller or to a grid inverter for AC coupling. And those that do have MPPTs, or just generally virtually all of the off-grid MPPTs, they will have voltages for 48-volt batteries up to about 150, maybe 200 volts, but that's pretty much, like, there's some exceptions, but they tend to be extremely expensive, where you go into the hundreds of volts. This device, if you paid attention in the beginning, we can handle up to 450 volts on the PV side. And we have an MPP voltage range of 120 to 430 volts for the 5K, and of 90 to 430 volts for the 3K model. So you have a lot of flexibility there in terms of your minimum and your maximum string length. So again, comparing this to like your typical off-grid charge controller, if you're working with something that has around about 150 volt open circuit maximum voltage, it means that if we're working with 60 cell PV modules, which I think are pretty much the cheapest worldwide, we will have 5+ strings if we're talking this kind of power class, like around about 5 kilowatts of PV power. And what will that mean? Well, as soon as you have more than 2 strings, you need a combiner box. Combiner box is basically, first of all, physically bringing together all of these multiple strings together and putting everything onto 1+ and 1-, which you then feed into your charge controller. And then also, you will need string fuses or diodes because there could be a reverse current situation between various strings. Virtually all the crystalline PV modules I know will accept up to 2 strings without any of these measures. So that really is one of the main ways you can save money with the AnyGrid, is by just saving on the number of strings you have, reducing those 5+ strings down to 1 or 2. And if you do that, you will just need standard Y cables if you're using 2 strings, and that's it. You don't need a combiner box, you don't need string fuses, you don't need string diodes and all those other things, which tend to add quite a lot to the system cost. So some other benefits of this higher PV voltage are you have much smaller cable cross sections to deal with. Coming from a combiner box, if you're dealing with 5 kilowatts at let's say around about 100 volts, you're going to be dealing with 16 millimeters squared. I'm not sure what that is in American wire gauge, but it's definitely a lot more. It's about 4 times as much than what we have here. So you can deal with very small cable cross sections, and pretty much the cables that come with your PV modules are all you need. You're not going to have to increase the wire cross section from that. So that already is a big cost saver there. You just save a lot of copper. Then, like I mentioned, you don't need a combiner box, which will add several $100s typically to your installation. No string fuses, no diodes. I've mentioned that. You generally have a lot less cables coming into your building, because if you're working with this traditional setup, either you have, in this case, 5 pairs, so 10 cables running into your home. So that's a big hole to drill to the outside world. Or you have your combiner box outside and bring in just the common positive and negative, in which case you still have thicker cables than for the AnyGrid. And on top of that, your combiner box now needs to be waterproof, UV-proof, etc., because it's sitting outside. So those are the trade-offs you would have with the combiner box. You don't have any of that with the AnyGrid. I'd like to look at extensibility as the last topic that's, let's say, a little bit less technical than the final 2 topics. For extensibility, you can see as a recap here your typical system, how it would look with the various optional components in your system. Now, if we want to have more power than what one AnyGrid can deliver, regardless of whether it's a 3 kilowatt or a 5 kilowatt model, we can hook up to 9 of these together. And we're very free in how we hook them together. We can have all units on a single phase. So we can have a single phase system with 45 kilowatts of synchronized AC power on a single phase. Or we can hook these up in 3 phase. And even if we hook it up in 3 phase, then we can even choose asymmetrical phases. So an example I give here is we might have 7 units on phase number 1, and just a single unit on phase 2 and a single unit on phase 3. And this might be a reasonable scenario if you're working with a large home, for example. You might have a lot of single phase loads, but you'll have a couple, 3 phase loads. And you have those last 2 inverters just there for those, like your circular saw and maybe your oven, which might be typical 3 phase devices. that will be running on these other two inverters. And all of your single-phase devices will be connected to the first 7, which will give you plenty of power on that single phase. Of course, you can also have symmetrical phases. Really, the only important thing is that you can have up to 9 units hooked together, so not more than 9, and that you must have at least 1 unit per phase. So if you're working with a single-phase system, of course, you can go from 1 to 9 units. And if you're using a 3-phase system, you need to have at least 1 on each phase, so obviously you need to have at least 3 units. All the necessary communication and interface cables are included with each AnyGrid, so there's no need to order anything special if you want to have systems with multiple synchronized units. There is a small caveat if you're using more than 1 unit, and this is less pronounced on a single-phase system, a little bit more pronounced on a 3-phase system. The switching time increases from 10 milliseconds to up to 50 milliseconds. Like 50 milliseconds is the worst-case scenario. Typically, it'll be somewhere between 10 and 50 milliseconds. Again, most computer power supplies will handle power outages up to 50 milliseconds, so we are still within spec for the majority of your loads. Here is what this looks like. On the left bottom here of the unit, you can see these green. These are green connectors. These are analog form of communication. They are just for parallel systems, so if you're using more than 1 unit per phase. And here we have all of the other communication. So what this means, I have a few examples for you here. If we set up 5 AnyGrids on a single phase, then we need the green cables and the gray cables. Because again, as soon as we have more than 1 unit on a phase, we will need the green cables. So that's what we have here. And either way, we definitely need to have the communication cables between the units where we synchronize all the settings, where if there's a phase shift, if you're using a 3-phase system, that's where the information travels for the phase shift, etc. So what's important for you is that they must all be on the same battery. You cannot have multiple batteries with these inverters. They will throw up an error if you do try that. And there's very few cases where I think that would make any sense. You also need to have breakers for each unit individually, just for the sake of safety. Now here's a further example, in this case, a 3-phase scenario. So I've purposely taken an asymmetrical scenario to show you again that you can use different numbers of units per phase. So in this case, we have 7 units on the first phase and 1 unit each on the second and third phase. So here, if you look at the interconnections between the units, they're the same on the gray side. You're always hooking up to the direct neighbor or 1 over between the communication cables. And that obviously makes sense because if you were to have to connect from unit number 1 to number 9, you could end up with many meters between the units and the cables might not be long enough. So it makes sense to have it hooked up like this. And then what you might notice is on phase 2 and phase 3, we have no green cables. Because like I said before, you only need the green cables if you have more than 1 unit per phase. On phase 2, we have just 1 unit, and the same thing goes for phase 3. For the system sizing, one of the first things is obviously the battery size, if you do use a battery. And I think the most important thing to keep in mind there is the minimum battery size. We recommend that you use, if you're using lead-acid batteries, regardless of whether they're gel, AGM, or open type batteries, liquid electrolyte, we recommend at least 200 amp hours per unit. So if you're using 2 units, you need to have at least 400 amp hours for the 48-volt system. If you're using lithium batteries, then typically you will have ratings for how many amps charging and discharging current are allowed on the batteries. So you can check that and make sure that it's compatible. As a reference here, the maximum charging current is 80 amps, regardless of whether it's PV, grid, or mixed. Again, you saw before, we can reduce that charging current if you need to cater towards smaller batteries. For the discharge, we have much higher currents because we're dealing with an inverter which can potentially be used off-grid, which means that in such a scenario, it would not be supported by a second energy source. So all of the 5 kilowatts or 10 kilowatt peak, we need to be able to draw those out of a battery if there's no PV available, for example. So that would mean continuous rating 140 amps, and peak rating to handle the 10 kilowatts for 5 seconds would be 280 amps per unit. Now, if you do want to use the PylonTech batteries, we're compatible with all of the 48-volt models. You can check with Rita Ping from PylonTech. Her email address is here if you want to source those in whatever country you're living in or where you're building the project. If you're using lithium batteries that are not from PylonTech, then for the moment, we don't have any others implemented in terms of communication. So you would need to make sure that they have a battery management system that does not require a communication with the inverter. For the PV array, the PV array must meet these requirements, and if it does, then it's automatically good for the system. This is specific to the 48-volt models. Obviously, there's only small minor differences for the 3 kilowatt 24-volt model. Namely, the minimum PV voltage is lower for the 3 kilowatt model. It's 90 volts MPP instead of 120 volts. So typically, this is the correct order in how I would size such a system. I would always look at the minimum PV voltage of the inverter. So in this case, we have 120 volts for the 48-volt 5 kilowatt model, and at the maximum PV voltage, which is 430 volts MPP and 450 volts open circuit. And you need to make sure that you never surpass the 450 volts, even if it's cold outside. You might have very cold winters, and you probably know PV modules will output a higher voltage when they're cold, so you need to take that into account for your region. Then we have a maximum usable PV current of 18 amps. So in practice, it just means 1 or 2 strings, and that's how you build your system. For each string, you have a minimum of 5 PV modules if you're working with 60-cell crystalline PV modules. So that means your minimum power for the 5 kilowatt unit is about 1.25 kilowatt peak, and the maximum is 11 PV modules in series. If it's really warm in your region, you never have cold winters, you might be able to fit in 12, but that's living at the edge basically. So I would recommend up to 11. And that means you can have up to 2.75 kilowatt peak per string, probably even a little bit more if you're using 270s or 280s as PV modules. And of course, you can use 1 or 2 strings, so that will give you up to 6 kilowatts peak that you can connect to the AnyGrid inverter. For the 3 kilowatt model, it's about 2/3 that, roughly. Make sure that you don't have more than 6 kilowatt peak connected. Nothing should break, but it typically doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of an investment to have more than 6 kilowatt peak connected. And there's a limit to what you can test. So we've tested it up to 6 kilowatt peak, and we know that works. And up to 4.8 kilowatts are truly usable by the inverter when the battery voltage is high and when you have the maximum solar irradiation. For the AC generator, things get a little bit cryptic, so I'll save that as just a pure dictionary for you if you need to look it up if you want to choose an AC generator to fit to the AnyGrid. What is important, I think, is to have a certain minimum generator size. And we recommend to have 1.5 times the nominal power of the inverter as a generator size. And the reason is quite simple. When you're working in AC or in grid mode, even though technically speaking, this is not a grid, it's an AC generator, then you need to be able to power all of your loads. And at the same time, if you're charging your battery, you need to be able to do that at the same time simultaneously. So if you're charging your battery with, say, 2 kilowatts, then you need to make sure that you can have another 5 kilowatts to power your loads. So you'll end up with about 7.5 kilowatts of power that your AC generator should be able to deliver. Now the final subject is grounding, and at the very end we have some recommendations as well. For grounding, grounding is obviously very important for safety. I don't have the time to explain why, but those that are installing the system should know. The mandatory grounding on the AnyGrid is both on the AC input and the AC output. Obviously, if you're just using one of the two, then You just need one ground point. They're connected internally. So you must absolutely connect those for safety. And you need to make sure that you have a low impedance ground at your area of installation. Then typically, and this really depends on your country, what kind of a grounding scheme you have. So I'm looking at TNCS here, which is common, I think, in most parts of the world, certainly is in Europe. In this kind of a scenario, to protect people, like the actual users from electric shock, you would use a residual current device, an RCD. And in order for that to work, there needs to be a connection between the neutral and the ground. And if a typical off-grid inverter is working in off-grid mode, as I told you before, it disconnects neutral and line from the grid. So basically this bridge you have here between neutral and ground no longer exists, because the whole first part is basically cut out of the system. So what the AnyGrid actually does internally is that's the last point here, it automatically bridges the neutral and ground wires. And that will simply ensure that if you're disconnected from the grid, that this bridge, which is absolutely important for the residual current device to work at all, is then made inside the device on the fly to make sure that your residual current device will always protect people from electric shock if ever they touch any of the phases or the neutral conductor. So the upside of this is that you don't need to have like a ground fault detection device or expensive equipment like that. An RCD, you will get that in any hardware store for $10 to $20. Then for grounding the DC side, really, like I said, the only mandatory grounding is the ground on the AC of the inverter. The rest here is voluntary, or, well, depending on your legislation, it might be mandatory. I think the one thing that really does make sense to ground is the frame of your PV modules and the structure they're mounted on. And this doesn't have any effect on the device whatsoever. You can ground your battery negative or your battery positive. And for PV, you're not allowed to ground either positive or negative. So battery, you're completely free to ground as you wish. For PV, you can only ground the frame of the PV modules. Then for the surge protection, as well, almost any inverter from any respectable brand out there, there is obviously some surge protection integrated into the unit on the PV side and on the AC input side and the AC output as well, battery as well. But all of these things have their limits, of course, and an external surge protector will always do a lot more and has a lot more, let's say, higher current ratings to be able to swallow a lot more energy and then to point that towards ground. So I would always recommend a surge protection, at least on the PV side, you'll see in the next slide, but also on the AC side. Again, this doesn't cost much. It's like in the realm of like $20 to $50 maybe. This is a very standard component, the surge protector for the grid side. So this is if there's any lightning or anything in your area, and you have a high voltage peak which is coming in through the grid, or if you have a AC generator, for example, this surge protective device will cancel that peak. So our recommendation, we have two models listed here for various different scenarios that you might have depending on the quality of the grid. And then for the PV side, we recommend this model. This is it's very important to have the correct rating for this for the SPD coming from PV, because I know a lot of people make the mistake. They think, oh, I'll just use any old SPD that I'm using for a grid-connected inverter, where a lot of these will actually only start protecting for voltages above 1,000 volts. So you can imagine this already has a very high maximum PV input voltage of 450 volts. But if you're connecting an SPD, which will only start protecting above 1,000 volts, well, that's still a difference of over 500 volts. So it's not going to do any protecting, because if the voltage rises to, let's say, 800 or 900 volts, the SPD is still not doing anything, and the inverter is already taking damage. So if you do install an SPD, which I do recommend, then do make sure you take the right one, because otherwise it will simply not function. It will not do its job of protecting from high voltage peaks. And that's all we have for you today.
For more videos and information, go to www.phocos.com. Phocos, making reliable energy access possible. Anywhere, anytime, any grid.